The air in Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, was thick with the scent of old money and new lies. It was a symphony of fragrances: truffle oil, vintage Bordeaux, the delicate perfume of women who had never known a moment of want, and the crisp, starched linen of the staff who served them. For 22-year-old Clara Finch, it smelled mostly of a fatigue so profound it had settled deep in her bones. Each quiet chime of a fork against bone china was another second ticking away on her 14-hour double shift. Then he was seated in her section, Alistair Vance, a man whose chiseled face, framed by a mane of silver hair, graced the covers of Art and Auction and Fortune with equal frequency. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a kingmaker, a man who could turn an unknown artist into a legend or relegate a masterpiece to obscurity with a single dismissive wave of his hand. His gallery, Vance Modern, was the center of the art world's universe. Tonight he was holding court, entertaining a cadre of investors with the practiced charm of a predator at ease in his natural habitat. As Clara moved with silent efficiency to refill his crystal water goblet, Vance produced a large velvet-lined portfolio. With a theatrical flourish, he presented a painting propped on a small, ornate easel he had brought for the occasion. It was a still life, a vase of wilting peonies on a dark, stormy background, rendered with a haunting, melancholic beauty. It was a style the world had never seen, and Vance was about to claim its discovery. But in that instant, Clara's world, a world held together by tip money and her mother's mounting medical bills, simply ceased to exist. Because she didn't just see a painting, she saw the familiar, aggressive impasto of the petals, a technique her father used to build texture. She saw the unique, almost invisible mixture of indigo and burnt umber in the shadows, a color he called midnight sorrow. And as Vance's guests leaned in to admire the work, her eyes were drawn to the bottom right corner. There, nestled almost invisibly within the dark stem of a fallen leaf, was the signature. It wasn't just a name, it was a ghost whisper, a signature she hadn't seen in 15 years, the signature of her father. Aurelia wasn't merely a restaurant. It was a grand stage where the city's elite performed their nightly dramas of power and acquisition. Clara Finch was a member of the invisible stage crew, a specter in a black bistro apron, her very presence designed to be felt but not seen. She was trained to anticipate the need for a fresh napkin, to clear a finished plate with the silent grace of a passing shadow. Her movements were a carefully choreographed ballet of efficiency, perfected over 3 grueling years of balancing trays laden with lobster bisque and plates of artfully arranged Wagyu beef. Tonight, the spotlight in her section was squarely on Alistair Vance. He wasn't just wealthy, he was gravitational. A man who had single-handedly dictated the last decade of the art market. His voice, a smooth baritone accustomed to absolute obedience, sliced through the restaurant's hushed reverence. He ordered for his entire table of 4 fawning investors without once consulting them or looking at Clara. "We'll begin with the caviar service, the beluga naturally, and a bottle of the 96 Krug. Ensure it is properly chilled, not frozen," he commanded, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her left shoulder. It was a classic power move, rendering her as much a piece of the furniture as the chair she stood beside. Clara simply inclined her head, her face a practiced mask of serene professionalism. "Of course, sir." Beneath the surface, a bitter, familiar cocktail of resentment and exhaustion swirled. She should have been mixing pigments, not serving cocktails. 3 years ago, she'd been the most promising student in the restoration program at the Pratt Institute, her hands possessing an innate understanding of canvas and color. Her future was a canvas of brilliant possibility. Then the call had come. Her mother, Eleanor, had suffered a debilitating stroke. The modest insurance ran out in months. The scholarship covered tuition, but not the crushing costs of a long-term care facility and the endless list of medications. So Clara had dropped out, trading a world of art history and chemical analysis for the brutal arithmetic of rent, bills, and copays. She moved her mother into a small, accessible apartment and took the highest-paying service job she could find, watching her dreams dry up like spilled watercolor. Her life had become a relentless, grinding loop. The pre-dawn quiet of the apartment, checking on her mother, the long subway ride into the city, the physically and emotionally draining dance of service, The late-night journey home, and the few precious hours spent with her father's old art books, trying to keep the artist's fire within her from being extinguished completely. Her father, David Finch, the gaping, unhealed wound in her life. He was a painter of breathtaking genius, a man who saw symphonies and sunsets and poetry in the decay of a fallen leaf. He would sketch on placemats, explaining the golden ratio to her as a bedtime story. He taught her how to see, truly see, not just the subject of a painting, but the soul of the artist in every brushstroke. 15 years ago, when she was 7, he had simply vanished. One day he was in his studio, a chaotic wonderland of turpentine and linseed oil, excitedly telling her he was on the brink of perfecting a new style, a way of painting not the thing itself, but the memory of it. The next, he was gone. The police found his car parked at an overlook in the Hudson Highlands. A note was found on the passenger seat, a rambling, desperate scrawl about failure, about the world not being ready for his vision. They ruled it a suicide. His body was never recovered from the river below. The loss had hollowed out their family. It broke her mother's heart long before the stroke broke her health. It left Clara with a gnawing, deep-seated conviction that the official story was a lie. Her father was a fighter, a man whose passion was a roaring bonfire. He wouldn't have just flickered out. "Waitress!" Vance's voice, sharp and laced with irritation, yanked her from the past. He gestured with a flick of his wrist at an empty breadbasket. "My apologies, sir." Clara moved forward, her hands steady despite the tremor of anger inside her. As she placed a fresh basket of warm brioche on the table, Vance, in a grand gesture of showmanship, unveiled the painting from its velvet portfolio. "Gentlemen," he announced to his rapt audience, his voice resonating with the pride of a conquering general. "Before we discuss future acquisitions, I want to show you the past, the genesis of what I am calling the Penumbra School, a newly discovered master, a tragic unknown figure from the early 2000s. I have named him Ethelred." He presented the canvas. It was the still life of dying peonies, achingly beautiful and profoundly sad. It was a masterpiece of light and shadow. Clara felt the air rush from her lungs. It was more than familiar. It was a part of her soul. She had watched him paint it. She remembered the day he'd brought the flowers home, explaining that beauty was most poignant when it was about to fade. Vance tapped a manicured finger near the bottom of the canvas. 20 years of searching, of following whispers and rumors, and now the first of his works comes to light. An investment that will reshape the market. His guests gasped and murmured in appropriate awe. But Clara wasn't listening. Her entire being was focused on that one dark corner of the canvas. There, woven into the stem of a leaf with a single hairbrush, was a signature. A confident, fluid script. The D, a proud, defiant loop. The F, a sharp, clean slash. Time dissolved. The sophisticated chatter of the restaurant faded to a dull, distant hum. The weight of the silver bread basket in her hand became unbearable. It was a signature she had traced with her own small finger on the back of his early sketches, on birthday cards filled with funny drawings, on the title pages of her favorite storybooks. It was the signature of the man who taught her that blue and yellow make green, but that sorrow and hope make art. David Finch. The world buckled, tilting violently on its axis. Every doubt, every suspicion, every quiet, lonely what if she had harbored for 15 years erupted into a single incandescent point of certainty. A cold, righteous fury, as sharp and pure as a shard of glass, sliced through her exhaustion. Her voice, when it emerged, was not the deferential, hushed tone of a waitress. It was quiet, clear as a bell, and it carried the crushing weight of 15 years of unresolved grief. "Sir," she said, her eyes locking with his, "that's my dad's signature." Alistair Vance froze, the smug, proprietary smile sliding from his face as if wiped clean by an invisible hand. For a terrifying naked moment, his face was a canvas of pure, unguarded shock. It wasn't just surprise. It was the abject horror of a man watching a corpse sit up in its coffin. It was the panicked, wide-eyed terror of a king whose castle walls were crumbling to sand around him. The carefully curated mask of cultured sophistication dissolved, revealing something raw, ugly and cornered beneath. The heavy crystal goblet of Krug he was raising to his lips slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. It seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat, a suspended moment of disbelief before it collided with the edge of the marble table. The sound wasn't the delicate tinkle of breaking glass. It was a sharp, violent crack, an explosion that ripped through the restaurant's sedate atmosphere. Shards of crystal sprayed across the table. Champagne, golden and effervescent, pooled around the broken stem, its fizzing tide creeping perilously close to the corner of the priceless painting. What did you just say?" Vance stammered, his voice a hoarse, strangled whisper. His eyes, wide with a frantic panic, darted from Clara's face to the signature, then back again, as if unable to process the impossible reality before him. His investors stared, mouths agape, their forks laden with caviar hovering forgotten in midair. The sudden violence of the shattered glass had fractured the evening. At nearby tables, conversations faltered and heads turned. Mr. Dubois, Aurelia's impeccably tailored and perpetually anxious general manager, was already gliding toward their table, his face a tight mask of damage control. Clara didn't flinch. The icy certainty that had taken root in her heart held her upright, a steel rod in her spine. She raised a hand, her finger trembling, but her aim true, pointing at the nearly invisible inscription on the canvas. "That signature," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "D. Finch. David Finch. He was my father." Vance's shock was rapidly being consumed by a wild, desperate fury. He lunged for the painting, snatching it away from the spreading puddle of champagne and frantically dabbing at the frame with a linen napkin. "This is preposterous," he boomed, his voice regaining its force but now brittle with a raw defensive anger. "Security! Get this! This delusional girl away from my table." "I'm not delusional," Clara shot back, her voice rising to meet his, cutting through the rising murmurs of the other diners. "I know his signature. I know his work. He mixed his own paints. That shadow under the vase, it's indigo, burnt umber, and a particle of lapis lazuli. He called it Midnight Sorrow. He told me he was painting The Memory of Peonies that summer. The specific details, the secret name of the color, the artist's poetic phrasing, struck Vance like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor beneath his expensive tan. These were secrets he thought were buried with the man himself. Secrets no one else on earth could possibly know. Mr. Dubois arrived, his professional smile stretched to a painful degree. "Mr. Vance, is there a problem?" "Ma'am, please. You are disturbing our patrons." "This waitress is harassing me," Vance snarled, shoving the painting back into its protective portfolio and snapping it shut. He pushed his chair back and stood, looming over Clara, trying to use his height and sheer presence to crush her. "She's clearly unstable. I want her fired. Now." "Sir, I can assure you," Dubois began, turning to Clara with pleading, desperate eyes. But Clara would not be silenced. 15 years of unanswered questions, of a hollow grief she was told to accept without proof, were boiling over. "He's a liar," she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute conviction. She looked past Vance directly into the stunned faces of his investors. "That painting, that ethel red he invented, it's my father's. David Finch. He disappeared 15 years ago. This man built his career on a stolen legacy and a lie." One of the investors, a shrewd-looking man with steel-gray hair named Mr. Peterson, glanced at Vance. A flicker of doubt, small but undeniable, appeared in his eyes. Vance's reaction was too visceral, too explosive for a simple case of a crazed employee. It was the reaction of a man whose deepest secret had just been dragged, kicking and screaming into the light. "That is enough," Vance roared. He lunged forward and grabbed Clara's arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like talons. "Get out! Get out of my sight!" Clara wrenched her arm away, stumbling back, the shock of his touch momentarily breaking her composure. "You can't just erase people, Mr. Vance. The truth doesn't work that way." Mr. Dubois, seeing a client worth millions a year on the verge of a full-blown public meltdown, made his choice. He stepped between them, his body a physical shield for Vance. Miss Finch, that's it. You're fired. Get your things from your locker and leave the premises. Now. Two formidable security guards, who had been hovering nearby, moved in. Their silent, imposing presence was a wall she could not pass. The fight suddenly drained out of Clara, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of injustice. She had spoken the truth, a truth she had carried alone for a decade and a half, and the world had instantly closed ranks to protect the powerful man and cast her out into the street. She looked at Alistair Vance one last time. The panic was gone from his face, replaced by a chilling, reptilian mask of controlled rage. His eyes locked with hers, and in them, she saw a silent, brutal promise. This is not over. I will ruin you for this. As the guards escorted her toward the staff exit, a path of silence and stares parting before them, she could hear Vance's voice, now artificially smooth as silk, attempting to salvage his evening. My deepest apologies, gentlemen. A disgruntled former employee, quite mad, I'm afraid. Now, about the projected auction value. The heavy, swinging door to the kitchen slammed shut behind her, cutting off his voice. Clara stood amidst the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam, her uniform suddenly feeling like a costume she no longer had the right to wear. She was fired, jobless. Her mother's next round of expensive medication was due in a week. But beneath the rising tide of panic and humiliation, a new feeling was taking root. It was a cold, hard, unyielding resolve. Vance's reaction hadn't been that of an innocent man wrongly accused. It was the raw terror of a guilty man exposed. He wasn't just a thief who had stolen a few paintings. He knew what happened to her father. Clara Finch, the poor, exhausted waitress, was gone. In her place stood the daughter of David Finch, and she had just discovered her new purpose in life, to uncover the truth and to write her father's name back into the history of art, no matter what it cost. He hadn't just vanished, he had been erased, and she was going to paint him back into existence. The termination was as swift and sterile as a guillotine. Mr. Dubois handed her a small cardboard box with the contents of her locker and her final paycheck, his face a stony mask of disapproval. He made it clear that she would receive no severance, no reference, and that if she ever set foot in Aurelia again, she would be arrested for trespassing. The message was unequivocal. Alistair Vance's reach was long, and his wrath was absolute. The subway ride home was a nauseating blur of flickering lights and the hollow echo of her own heartbeat. The weight of her new reality was a physical pressure on her chest. No job, a sick mother, and a new, terrifyingly powerful enemy. It was an equation with no possible positive solution. When she finally let herself into their small, quiet apartment, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of her mother's oxygen concentrator from the bedroom. The sight of the closed door, behind which her mother slept, so fragile and dependent on her, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What had she done? She had detonated their fragile life for a single moment of righteous, impossible truth. She sank onto the worn floral sofa, burying her face in her hands. The scene from the restaurant replayed in her mind on a torturous loop, the shock on Vance's face, the venom in his eyes, the names she had spoken aloud. Midnight sorrow, the memory of peonies. It wasn't a fantasy, it was real. A new thought cut through her despair like a searchlight. For 15 years, she had only had grief and a vague, formless suspicion. Now she had a name. Alistair Vance. She had a target. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline that shoved her exhaustion aside, Clara went to the hall closet and pulled out a dusty, forgotten footlocker from beneath a pile of old blankets. It was filled with the few things she had managed to save from her father's studio before the bank repossessed the house. It smelled of old paper, turpentine, and a grief she had kept locked away for half her life. She knelt on the floor and began to search, not for a single piece of evidence, but for a connection, a thread, anything that could tie Vance to her father. She sifted through old canvases, stacks of preliminary sketches, and bundles of letters. And then she found it. Tucked inside a thick sketchbook was a faded manila envelope. Inside were not drawings, but a handful of old photographs. Her breath hitched. There was her father, 15 years younger, his face bright with passion, his arm slung around a much younger, leaner Alistair Vance. They were standing in a messy, paint-spattered studio, grinning at the camera. They looked like partners, like friends. Vance wasn't just a corporate vulture who had stumbled upon her father's work after his death. They had known each other. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a betrayal of the deepest, most personal kind. She kept digging. At the bottom of the envelope, she found a single piece of folded, yellowed paper. It was a carbon copy of a consignment agreement between David Finch and the then-fledgling Vance Gallery. It listed 10 specific paintings, including one described as Peonies, Still Life, Oil on Canvas. It was dated just 2 weeks before her father disappeared. The most chilling part was the signature at the bottom. It was her father's name, but the signature itself was a grotesque, clumsy forgery. The proud, defiant loop of the D was cramped and hesitant. The sharp, clean slash of the F was wobbly and uncertain. It looked nothing like the confident, fluid signature on a dozen other documents and sketches in the footlocker. The signature she knew as well as her own reflection. This was it. This was the proof. Vance hadn't just acquired the paintings. He had created a false paper trail. He had likely presented this forged document after her father disappeared, claiming legal ownership of the initial works that launched his legendary career. A cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her feel physically ill. The story of her father's suicide suddenly took on a much more sinister hue. A brilliant artist on the verge of a breakthrough, whose entire foundational collection was about to be stolen by a partner he trusted. Would he fall into despair and walk into a river? Or would he fight back? And what would a ruthless, ambitious man like Alistair Vance do to someone who stood in the way of his future empire? The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. Vance hadn't just stolen her father's legacy, he had stolen her father. Clara carefully gathered the forged document in the photograph. The dust from the footlocker no longer felt like the dust of the past. It felt like gunpowder. For 15 years, she had been a victim, adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. Now, she had evidence. She had a direction, and she had an enemy. As the first gray fingers of dawn crept through the apartment window, Clara felt a profound transformation within herself. The fear was still there, a tight, cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a white-hot, burning resolve. She was no longer just fighting for the memory of her father. She was fighting for his life. She had to prove he didn't sign that paper, that he wasn't a tragic suicide but a victim. She had to find out what really happened 15 years ago. And she knew, with absolute certainty, she could not do it alone. Clara understood that walking into a police station with a 15-year-old forged document and the word of a fired waitress against a man like Alistair Vance would be a fool's errand. They would show her the door before the words art fraud had fully left her lips. She needed someone who already knew how to fight giants, someone unafraid of Vance because Vance had already done his worst to them. She spent the day at the New York Public Library, diving into their archives, searching for any chink in Vance's polished armor. His public record was suspiciously immaculate. But as she delved into microfiche records of art journals and defunct magazines from a decade prior, she found a name: Julian Croft. Julian Croft had been the art world's sharpest critic, an investigative journalist for Artisan magazine, known for his razor-sharp intellect and his refusal to be charmed by money or power. And 12 years ago, he had set his sights on Alistair Vance. He published a meticulously researched expose questioning the miraculous discovery of several artists Vance had championed, hinting at forged provenances and suggesting that Vance was more of a master marketer than a master curator. The retaliation had been swift and devastating. Vance didn't just sue, he orchestrated a character assassination. He leaked doctored emails that made Julian look like he was trying to extort galleries. He paid off 2 of Julian's key sources, who publicly recanted their statements and branded him a liar. Artisan magazine, facing a ruinous lawsuit, buckled. They settled out of court, fired Julian Croft, and issued a full-page retraction. Julian was professionally obliterated. He was excommunicated from the world he loved. Clara found what was left of him through a bitter, cynical blog he now ran from his apartment, a rambling manifesto against the commodification of art. Read by a few dozen loyalists and conspiracy theorists. He was a wounded lion, still roaring, but from the lonely confines of a cage of his own making. He was perfect. His apartment was in a pre-war walk-up in the East Village, the kind with peeling paint in the hallways and a permanent scent of garlic and dust. She knocked on the door of 5C, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who answered looked like a ghost of his former author photos. He was perhaps in his late 40s, with intelligent, weary eyes shadowed by years of disappointment. His hair was a mess, his shirt was rumpled, and his apartment behind him was a chaotic landscape of books, auction catalogs, and empty coffee mugs. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice gravelly with disuse. "Are you Julian Croft?" He leaned against the doorframe, his expression a perfect blend of suspicion and utter boredom. "Depends. If you're from a collection agency, I'm not him. If you have a subpoena, the cat accepts service." "My name is Clara Finch," she said, clutching the strap of her tote bag. "I read your articles about Alistair Vance." His eyes narrowed. The boredom evaporated, replaced by the sharp, painful glint of a freshly picked scab. "Ancient history, kid. I was wrong. The magazine said so. The courts said so. The whole damn world said so. Now, if you'll excuse me." He began to close the door. "Wait." Clara put her hand out, pressing it against the wood. "You weren't wrong. You were just missing the key. The first lie everything else was built on." He paused, studying her face. He saw not a fanatic or a groupie, but a young woman with a desperate, unwavering seriousness in her eyes. He let out a long, weary sigh and opened the door a little wider. "You've got 5 minutes. My tolerance for lost causes is at an all-time low." His apartment was the den of an obsessive. One entire wall was covered in a massive corkboard, a chaotic spiderweb of photographs, articles, and index cards, all connected by colored yarn, all converging on a single, smiling photograph of Alistair Vance in the center. "You're still investigating him?" Clara said. It wasn't. The air in Julian Croft's apartment was a stagnant cocktail of stale coffee, old paper, and a cynicism so thick it felt like a physical presence. It was a mausoleum dedicated to one man's downfall, and on the central wall, Alistair Vance's photograph reigned like a smiling, malevolent god. The alliance Clara forged there was not one of hope, but of shared wreckage. They were two ghosts haunting the same man, and in that shared purpose, they found a strange, desperate gravity. Julian's transformation was a slow, difficult alchemy. The years of bitterness had calcified around his journalistic instincts, and at first every lead was met with a reflexive sneer, every potential plan dismissed with a world-weary sigh. But Clara's quiet, unwavering certainty was a solvent, slowly dissolving his protective shell. She did not possess his knowledge of the art world's sordid underbelly, but she had something he had long since lost, a truth that was personal, elemental, and absolute. She wasn't chasing a story, she was reclaiming a soul. Their days blurred into a grueling rhythm. Julian resurrected contacts who had long considered him a professional leper, his voice a gravelly ghost on phone lines, trading old favors for whispers and rumors. Clara, meanwhile, became an archaeologist of her own life. She excavated her father's journals, not for clues, but for his voice. She read his meditations on light and shadow, his theories on how a single brushstroke could contain the entire history of an emotion. She was not merely building a case, she was rebuilding her father, brushstroke by brushstroke, word by word, until his presence in the room was as tangible as the dusty air they breathed. Their search for Marcus Thorne felt like chasing a phantom. The old framer had meticulously scrubbed himself from the modern world. But Julian, in his exile, had become a master of the forgotten archives, of the paper trails that persist long after digital footprints have faded. He found him not through a database, but through a faded notice in a 20-year-old guild newsletter, cross-referenced with a small-town property tax ledger. The Catskills workshop was steeped in the scent of wood shavings and turpentine, a smell that transported Clara back to her childhood with a painful, visceral lurch. Marcus Thorne was a man bent double by the weight of a 15-year-old secret. When Clara spoke her father's name, it was not an accusation but a key, unlocking a floodgate of guilt that washed the color from his face. His confession, when it came, was a torrent of whispered shame. He sat amongst the skeletons of antique chairs and headless armoires, his voice a dry rasp, and painted a portrait of a young Alistair Vance, a man whose ambition was a furnace that burned everything it touched. He called David his discovery, Marcus rasped, his trembling hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. But he was a prospector who had found a vein of pure gold and planned to claim the entire mountain for himself. He knew David's genius was matched only by his naivete. David thought he'd found a partner. He'd found a predator. The story of the forged bill of sale, of the coercion, tumbled out, but it was the detail of the hidden signature that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. The hummingbird's wing, Marcus confessed, tears finally carving clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. He hid one in every piece. For your mother, he said, a tiny, iridescent promise hidden in the shadows. It was his soul on the canvas. Vance knew it was the one thing an expert might find, a tell that couldn't be forged. He paid me a fortune to paint over them, to blind them, to erase the last piece of David's love from his own work. A memory flared in Clara's mind, sharp and bright. Her, age 6, sitting on a stool in the studio, her father dabbing a brush with a microscopic tip into a dark corner of a canvas. Well, what are you painting, Daddy?" He had smiled, his eyes full of a secret joy. "A little bit of magic, just for Mommy. It's a hummingbird's wing, so it can fly to her when I'm not there." "Did you do it?" Julian's voice was sharp, cutting through her reverie. Marcus Thorne looked at his own hands as if they were alien things, instruments of a crime he could no longer comprehend. "I couldn't," he whispered. "I was a coward. I took his money. I signed the authentication that damned your father. But I could not commit that final blasphemy. I couldn't paint over his heart. I told Vance the job was done. He never looked back. His arrogance was his only blind spot." Hope, fragile and terrifying, bloomed in Clara's chest. The proof was still there, hidden, waiting. "What happened to him, Marcus?" she pressed, her voice trembling. "What happened after he confronted Vance?" "David was furious, betrayed. He threatened to expose everything," Marcus said, his gaze distant. Vance just smiled, a cold, flat smile. He told David, "In the art world, history is not written by the artist. It is written by the historian. And I am the only historian this world will ever know." That was the last I heard. A week later, they found his car by the river. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes begging for absolution. Vance didn't just steal his work, child. He stole his existence. He erased him from the page and wrote a new story in his place. The name of the gilded prison came last. Blackwood Manor. A discreet residence, where Vance stored some of his most delicate pieces, a place with perfectly controlled air. Julian's fingers flew across his keyboard, his face illuminated by the screen's cold light. He navigated a labyrinth of shell corporations and holding companies with the grim familiarity of a man retracing his own murderer's steps. "It's a prison?" Julian breathed, his face ashen. "A 5-star memory care facility in the Adirondacks, specializing in patients with unreliable narratives. It's a place where the wealthy and powerful dispose of inconvenient people. It's owned, 3 companies deep, by Vance Modern." The room fell silent. The truth was monstrous, far worse than a simple theft, more cruel than murder. For 15 years, her father had been alive, a ghost in a machine of Vance's making, robbed of his art, his name, his family, and finally his own mind. He hadn't been killed. He had been curated, stored away like a painting in a lightless vault, preserved for the sole purpose of his non-existence. "We can't go to the police," Julian said, his voice flat and hard. "Vance has a 15-year head start. He's created a legal fortress. He has doctors on his payroll who will testify your father has been suffering from dementia for decades. It would be your word, the word of a fired waitress and a discredited journalist against a mountain of fabricated evidence." Clara felt a cold fury solidify within her. Panic was a luxury she could no longer afford. "So we don't use the law," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "We use his world. We use his stage. Julian looked up, a flicker of the old predatory reporter in his eyes. The auction, he whispered. He's holding a landmark single artist auction in 3 weeks. Ethelred, the lost master of the Penumbra school. He's betting his entire reputation on it. The peonies is the star lot. He built his empire on a lie, Clara said, her gaze fixed on Vance's smiling face on the wall. It's only fitting we tear it down with the truth. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. It had 2 phases. The first was an infiltration, a mission to retrieve not a person, but a single, undeniable piece of proof. Evidence of David Finch's current existence and artistic ability. The second phase was the public execution. Clara was the only one who could go into Blackwood. Posing as Anna, a prospective client's daughter touring the facility for her ailing father, she was a study in feigned grief and filial concern. Julian had forged her documents, coached her for hours on the language of palliative care, on the subtle tells of old money. As she drove the rented car up the winding, isolated mountain road, every nerve in her body screamed in protest. Blackwood Manor was not a hospital. It was a beautiful, silent lie. Manicured lawns swept down to a placid lake. The architecture was a soothing blend of stone and glass. But the air inside was sterile, controlled, devoid of life. The residents drifted through pristine hallways like elegant ghosts, their eyes vacant, their memories managed by a smiling, implacable staff. It was a place designed to be forgotten. Clara's tour guide was a woman with a practiced, sympathetic smile and the cold, watchful eyes of a prison guard. Clara asked the right questions, her voice choked with manufactured emotion. As they passed the art therapy room, she paused. "My father, he used to paint," she murmured, looking through the glass. "It was the only thing that brought him peace." The guide's smile tightened. "We find creative expression very therapeutic. Our residents are encouraged to explore their memories." Clara saw him then, through the glass. He was sitting by a window, a sketchbook in his lap. His hair was completely white, his vibrant energy replaced by a deep, unsettling stillness. He was thinner, a pale echo of the man in her memories. But it was him. Her heart seized in her chest, a knot of agony and love so intense it almost brought her to her knees. He was staring out at the lake, his pencil motionless. He looked lost. Not just old, but hollowed out, as if his very soul had been systematically emptied. Clara excused herself, feigning a wave of overwhelming grief. She found a unisex bathroom, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the lock. She leaned against the cool marble, gasping for air. The image of her father's vacant eyes burned into her mind. This was the true nature of Vance's crime. He hadn't just caged the man, he had tried to cage his genius. She had one chance. Julian had discovered that Vance, in his supreme arrogance, kept a small private gallery at Blackwood to display his most prized Ethelred works for potential buyers seeking absolute discretion. It was located in a separate wing, accessible via a staff corridor. Armed with a stolen keycard, a duplicate Julian had paid a disgruntled ex-employee a small fortune for, Clara slipped away from the tour. The gallery was a shrine to Vance's lie. There they were, the still lifes, the landscapes, the portraits of sorrow, all signed with the phantom name Ethelred. And in the center of the room, on a climate-controlled pedestal, was dying peonies. Under the gallery's focused lights, it was more beautiful and heartbreaking than she remembered. Her father's soul was right there, trapped under glass. Fighting back tears, she took out a small, high-powered UV flashlight. She aimed its violet beam at the darkest part of the canvas, at the stem of a fallen leaf where she knew the false signature lay. Nothing. Then she moved it to the deep, indigo shadow beneath the vase, a pool of midnight sorrow. And there it was, a faint, glowing shape, invisible in normal light. A perfect, iridescent hummingbird's wing, pulsing with a secret light. Marcus had told the truth. Her father's love was still there. She photographed it with a micro camera, her hands steady now, fueled by a glacial rage. But that wasn't enough. She needed proof of life. She made her way back towards the art therapy room. The guide was nowhere in sight. The residents were being led to the dining hall for their meticulously scheduled lunch. But her father was still there, by the window, a lone orderly collecting sketchbooks from a bin. Clara walked in, her heart a trip hammer against her ribs. "Excuse me," she said to the orderly, her voice calm. "I'm Anna. Dr. Albright sent me. I just need to see his most recent work for my father's file." The orderly, a young man who looked bored and overworked, barely glanced at her. He gestured to the sketchbook on the table. "Take it. It's all just scribbles anyway." Clara approached the table. She looked at her father. He didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on some distant point only he could see. "Dad?" she whispered, the word a painful stone in her throat. There was no flicker of recognition. Nothing. Her time was running out. She opened the sketchbook. The pages were filled with hesitant, broken lines, fragments of images that made no sense. It was the work of a mind in chains. Tears streamed down her face. She flipped to the last page. There was a single fresh drawing done in graphite. It was a detailed, exquisitely rendered drawing of a single feather. It was shaky, but the genius was still there, a flickering ember in the ashes. And beneath it, as if drawn by instinct, by a muscle memory that had survived the chemical fog, was a tiny, perfect hummingbird's wing. She tore the page from the book with a quiet, decisive rip. She folded it, slipped it into her pocket, and walked out of the room without looking back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she would shatter. 3 weeks later, the art world gathered at the prestigious Lexham's auction house for the sale of the century. The room buzzed with the electric thrill of money and history being made. Alistair Vance stood in a private skybox, observing the scene like an emperor. This was the culmination of his life's work, the moment his greatest fiction would be cemented as fact, valued in the tens of millions of dollars. Julian, looking uncomfortable but determined in a borrowed suit, sat in the press section, a laptop in his bag. Clara, dressed in a simple black dress, sat in the back, a ghost at the feast. She was invisible, just as she had been at Aurelia. But tonight, she was not a waitress. She was a reckoning. The auction was a masterclass in theatricality. Lot after lot of Ethelred's work sold for staggering sums. The tension built. Finally, the main event. Dying Peonies was brought onto the stage, bathed in a reverent light. "And now Lot 37, the auctioneer announced, his voice booming. "The painting that started it all, the work that launched the Penumbra School. We will open the bidding at $20 million. A flurry of bids erupted. 22 million, 25, 30. Vance smiled from his box, raising a glass of champagne. At 32 million, a new voice cut through the room. "A point of information for the bidders." All heads turned. Julian Croft was standing, a microphone in his hand, a technician he'd bribed standing by the main projection screen. Before security could react, the image of dying peonies on the screen was replaced by the photograph of a young David Finch and Alistair Vance. "Before you spend $32 million, Julian's voice rang out, clear and steady, "you should know the name of the artist you are buying. His name is not Ethelred. His name is David Finch." A shocked gasp swept the room. Vance went rigid in his box, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He barked into his phone, demanding security intervene. On the screen, the image changed to the forged bill of sale, next to an example of David's true signature. "This is the lie Alistair Vance's career was built upon," Julian declared. "A forgery used to steal the life's work of his partner." The screen changed again. This time it was Clara's UV photograph, showing the glowing, ethereal hummingbird's wing. Vance's lie was so complete, he even tried to paint over the artist's true secret signature, a mark of love for his wife. The final image appeared, the graphite drawing of the feather, torn from the sketchbook. "But you cannot kill genius," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "This was drawn less than a month ago by David Finch, who is not dead. He is a prisoner in a private facility owned and controlled by Alistair Vance, where he has been held for 15 years. Security was swarming him now, but the damage was done. The room was in chaos. The bidders were lowering their paddles, staring at Vance's box with expressions of horror and disgust. Then Clara stood up. She walked calmly to the front of the room. All eyes fell on her. My name is Clara Finch, she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. David Finch is my father. Everything you have been told tonight is the truth. Mr. Vance did not discover an artist. He buried one. Alistair Vance stood frozen in his skybox, the champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. In that moment, he was not a king. He was just a man, naked and exposed in a castle of his own lies, watching as the walls turned to dust around him. He wasn't just ruined. He was erased. The months that followed were a slow, painful dawn. Alistair Vance was consumed by a firestorm of lawsuits and federal investigations. His empire crumbled, his name becoming a byword for the art world's most monstrous fraud. He was stripped of his collection, his galleries, his legacy. He was left with nothing but the truth, an asset he had never learned to value. David Finch came home. The legal battle to free him was arduous, but the public evidence was overwhelming. He emerged from Blackwood Manor a fragile, tentative man, a stranger to a world that had moved on without him. His reunion with Eleanor was a thing of quiet, heartbreaking beauty. There were few words. He simply took her hand, the one that could still move, and held it for hours. The 15 stolen years, a vast, silent ocean between them. His recovery was not a miracle. It was a patient, difficult process of reclamation. There were days of profound confusion, of deep, vacant sadness. The drugs and the isolation had taken a terrible toll, but slowly, with Clara's help, the light began to return to his eyes. Julian Croft wrote the story. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism that won him a Pulitzer and restored his name. But he found his victory hollow without purpose. He sold the movie rights to his book and used the money to start a foundation, the Finch Project, dedicated to protecting artists from predatory practices and authenticating the work of those who had been exploited. His redemption was not in his return to glory, but in ensuring no one else would suffer Vance's fate. Clara found her own peace not in the headlines or the courtrooms, but in the quiet of a new studio. It was a large, sun-filled space she rented with the first proceeds from the court-ordered restitution and sale of her father's authenticated work. One afternoon, months later, she was mixing paints on a palette. The familiar scent of linseed oil and turpentine filled the air. It was no longer the smell of grief. It was the smell of creation. Her father sat in a chair by the window, sketching in a new book. He was still quiet, still distant, but he was present. He was home. He looked over at her canvas, a large abstract piece exploding with color and movement. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft. One of the first questions he had asked about her work. Clara looked at the swirling chaos of blues and golds on her canvas, at the raw emotion she had finally allowed herself to unleash. She thought of the journey, the crushing fatigue of Aurelia, the ghost of her father, the cold fury, the terrifying hope, and the quiet, steady work of rebuilding a life. "It's a memory," she said, a small smile touching her lips as she picked up a fine-tipped brush. "The memory of a sunrise." She turned back to her work, and in a deep, shadowed corner of the canvas, in a place only she would ever know to look, she painted a tiny, perfect, iridescent wing. It was not for her mother or for her father. This one was for herself, a secret promise that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a way to fly back into the light.